In the previous video, we took an in-depth look at the life of David Parker Ray and the events leading up to his more well-known misdeeds. We discussed the circumstances surrounding his birth, the abandonment by his parents, his troubled childhood as a school outcast, and his abusive upbringing with his grandparents. We discussed his 4 failed marriages, the birth of his 2 children, and his constant moving around due to multiple jobs. And finally, we discussed his progressive dive into depravities, starting with his introduction to BDSM through his father's old magazines, to the cave of horrors he built on his property at Elephant Butte Lake. David isn't the only character we were introduced to. We also discussed the life of his daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Parker Ray, and her tainted upbringing seeing her father's dark descent. The last event we spoke about was how she eventually moved in with David due to his slow erosion of the relationship she had with her former wife, Terry Haffenbreck. In the second part of this horrid tale, we will introduce 2 other characters and discuss the escalation that resulted from their introduction into the Ray household. We now resume our deep dive inside the case of the Toybox Killer, David Parker Ray. In August 1995, Jessie Ray officially moved in with her father at Elephant Butte Lake and left her former wife behind for the last time. Within the first month, the toll her upbringing around David's violent tendencies had taken started to manifest itself. She began ingratiating herself with the patrons at the local bars and Truth and Consequences in Elephant Butte, building a friend circle that would have no inclination of her true character. She would spend her time building her reputation as one of the best pool players in town and would participate in karaoke nights, accompanying herself with the guitar. Things didn't stay so calm and carefree, however, and the cracks started to show on September 30th, 1995. Jessie was spending the evening with a 22-year-old woman named Jill Troya at a bar on Albuquerque's red light district of Central Avenue. After that night, Troya was never seen or heard from again. Other patrons at the bar reported that they saw the 2 women arguing before Troya's disappearance, which would make Jessie the last one to see her alive. Troya's disappearance was only reported days later when her mother stated she hadn't spoken to her daughter since the week prior. Jessie would be questioned about the disappearance by law enforcement, but ultimately would be released due to the lack of evidence and a crime had occurred. She would become the prime suspect of Troya's disappearance when her case was reopened 5 years later. Like I stated in the previous video, this incident was swept under the rug due to the criminal culture of Truth and Consequences. Over the coming months, Jessie built a circle of friends that were extremely tight-knit and had a ritual where they would meet at a bar called Raymond's Lounge off of North Date Street, shoot pool to start off the night, and then tour local bars until the wee hours of the morning. The group consisted of motor mechanic Todd Thompson, Dam Site barman Dave Connolly, Becky Smith, David Carrasco, Cassandra Witt, and Jamie Rolando. The circle would expand to add new members over time, but one of the more important additions was a friend of Becky Smith, Kelly Van Cleave. Kelly was a bubbly and fun-loving woman born in Wisconsin in 1974 into a successful farming family. She was a daddy's girl until her teenage years when she began to rebel against societal norms under the impression that her relationship with her father was becoming strained. She began using marijuana and engaging in sexual relationships that would ultimately destroy her reputation as a bright student with now deteriorating grades. This only worsened her issues with her father, to the point she fell in love with a much older, extremely abusive man during her senior year of high school. In 1992, Kelly abandoned her loving family and moved in with her lover only to realize she'd made a horrible mistake. She would be locked in his apartment for days at a time and would be beaten frequently whenever an argument arose. One such example of this is a particular argument that ended with a telephone thrown full force at her, hitting her directly in the head. The 9-month relationship ended when her friends staged an intervention, resulting in Kelly moving to Kansas City to live with friends. Though this first relationship had concluded, she would continue to have a string of unhealthy relationships. She had an affair with her boss after taking a job as a babysitter and moved with him to Truth and Consequences for a job as a child care worker in 1994, the guy walking out on her not too long after they moved. She decided to stay and moved in with a friend, soon having a whirlwind relationship with a man named Clay Klein that resulted in an impulsive marriage that ended in a matter of weeks. She took a second job as a cocktail waitress where she met Becky Smith and was introduced through Becky to Jessie Ray, whom she later believed to be a close friend and confidant. In 1996, she met the next man in her life at Raymond's Lounge, 24-year-old Marine Patrick Murphy. Patrick went into detail about how their relationship began with showing each other their tattoos while he lied about his age, saying he was 24 at the time. He introduced her to his parents, and they met every day for the next 3 weeks, quickly laying out ground rules for their relationship since he didn't want to tarnish his military career. After a trip to visit Becky Smith, he came to realize that Kelly's friends were a bunch of, quote, long-haired bums and burned-out drug users, end quote, and made her promise not to bring them around him or his family. Their relationship would be taken to an unexpected level when one of the other girls in Kelly's friend group, Cassandra Witt, became absolutely obsessed with Patrick and the idea of breaking them up. They decided to stage a fake wedding to get Cassandra to back off that ended up becoming real just hours before it occurred, Kelly moving in with the Murphys while her now husband was deployed. Not 9 days later, the cracks started showing in their marriage when the newlyweds had an argument over her medical issues that made sex incredibly painful and her subsequent refusal to consummate their union because of it. The following day, Kelly went to Becky's house at around 10 a.m. to talk about her marital spat before heading to Cassandra's home for a quick chat about the rivalry over Patrick. Cassandra and Kelly left around 11:20 a.m. to pick up Dave Connolly and get drunk at a dingy bar called Rocky's Lounge, Kelly taking the role as the designated driver of the group while the other three immediately started ordering beers. Jessie Ray soon joined the party and they migrated over to Raymond's Lounge around 4 p.m., Todd Thompson also joining in on the festivities not long after their arrival. The group, except for Kelly, drank beer and shot pool until 8 p.m. before migrating once again to the Blue Waters Saloon in Elephant Butte. Kelly had 1 beer during her time at Blue Waters from the time they arrived to 11 p.m., taking Dave home and being brought back by Todd. Todd and Cassandra got into an argument around midnight and left together, the only two of the group left being Jessie and Kelly. When Kelly expressed her worry about not having a ride back home, Jessie offered to give her one on her motorbike, and the two stayed a short while longer. During the time between taking Dave home and Jessie offering to drive her home, Kelly could tell something was wrong when she was strongly intoxicated over the single beer she consumed that entire evening. She initially thought Cassandra had spiked her drink while she was gone as some sort of further effort to break up her marriage to Patrick. Plans changed when Jessie said she was too drunk to drive Kelly back home and suggested that they stay at her father's home until they sobered up, which Kelly had been to on multiple occasions and had met David at. Kelly later testified that the time between her leaving the bar and arriving at 513 Bass Road was a complete blur, the first thing she remembered being Jessie telling her to wait in the living room before disappearing into the back of the house. The rest of her memories of what happened next came back to her in nightmares. What seemed about 10 minutes later, Jessie returned with David Parker Ray in tow, and they sat at either side of her. David brandished a knife and placed it at her throat while Jessie handcuffed her and placed a collar around her neck. Duct tape was placed over her mouth and eyes before she was taken to Satan's Den just 30 feet from the residence, the stress and fear so intense that she lost consciousness. While she was unconscious, David set to stripping her naked, placing her on the gynecological chair and using the nylon straps to bind her thighs and ankles. She was lifted until she was suspended in the air by an elaborate overhead pulley system of heavy chains before she was lowered back onto the chair with her legs now spread wide apart and her arms over her head. David began filming the ordeal at this point. The overhead camera zoomed in on her body so everything could be recorded and viewable on the monitor in real time. Kelly was woken up with smelling salts and forced to listen to the horrifying orientation tape, remembering that the room stunk of chloroform. She recalls that the duct tape on her eyes came loose, showing her the extensive amount of sex toys and torture devices lining the walls and placed in cabinets around the toy box. A clearly flaccid David proceeded to attempt inserting different-sized dildos into Kelly's womanhood, becoming frustrated as none of them would fit. He then used his fingers to feel around inside of her, quote, like he was trying to play doctor, unquote, trying to find why she could not be penetrated. He clumsily felt up her chest as he explained that he and the satanic group he belonged to were watching her for some time, that they wanted her as a sex toy and would be, quote unquote, mad that the toys wouldn't fit. If they didn't fit, she would be considered useless to the cult and become expendable. David gave up on his first attempt at torturing her after 30 attempted insertions, leaving her where she was in a frustrated frenzy. She was kept in the toy box for 3 full days, David making 5 more failed attempts to torture her and becoming increasingly frustrated over this period. He never fed her or gave her a drop of liquid to drink, chaining her up like a dog with handcuffs on her wrists and shackles on her feet before taking her to a portal potty at the other end of the toy box to watch her use the toilet when she needed to relieve herself. Throughout the whole ordeal, Kelly begged to be let go and to be taken home. I kept telling him I wanted to go home. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to go home. During the 3-day ordeal Kelly was going through, her disappearance sent Patrick into a drunken spiral. He spent the first night drunk after looking for her, filed a missing persons report the next morning, listened to Cassandra when she advised an annulment of his marriage to Kelly after telling him and his parents about being out drinking with her the previous night, and then completely wrote her off by Sunday morning. After 3 nights and 2 days of pure torture, Kelly was taken out in David's work vehicle on Sunday at 8 a.m. so he could turn her in to the proper authorities, with the story that she was found completely incoherent wandering around the beach. He had taken her wedding ring, watch, and other jewelry as souvenirs of his crimes with her and drugged her as promised in the orientation tape before taking her to the Murphy home. David claimed he had found her on the beach and gotten her an iced tea from McDonald's because she was so dehydrated, which was a lie since he had only gotten himself a coffee that she was forced to watch him drink. Though she was still in the same clothing she was abducted in, was remarkably dirty and unkempt for someone who was almost obsessed with cleanliness and hygiene, and always had a bubbly predisposition. The Murphys believed every word of David's story and turned further against Kelly. Patrick accused her of lying, her mother-in-law accused her of being on drugs, and Cassandra gleefully helped kick Kelly out of the Murphy household. She was immediately told to leave and wasn't allowed back into the house, forcing her to stay with Dave overnight. In pain both physically, mentally, and emotionally, along with having no idea what had been done to her the prior days, Kelly was forced to sign annulment papers the next morning. Kelly was forced to live with Dave Connolly until she got herself back on her feet and would later be diagnosed with acute post-traumatic stress disorder 5 years later once her memories had started to return and the events of those once forgotten days were pieced back together. On the brighter side, karma bit Patrick and his family in the ass not long after. Patrick and Cassandra got married in Vegas 2 days after he divorced Kelly, which didn't work out at all, and when his deployment to the Persian Gulf ended just over 8 months later, he returned to find that she had taken control of and completely ruined his finances. All of this is rather ironic when you think about how just a week before Kelly's ordeal, David and Jessie were heralded by local media for trying to rescue an injured wildfowl named Ziggy that ultimately died of unexplained causes. David and Jessie couldn't hurt animals, but they had no problems torturing somebody that was supposed to be a friend. Now that we've gone over one of the most important victims, I think it's time to introduce the third depraved individual involved in this case, Dennis Roy Yancey. Yancey was born in Truth and Consequences on June 4th, 1971, to a policeman and legal secretary unlike most children in the crime-infested town. He was a hyperactive child that did anything for attention, even high school teachers branding him as a quote-unquote Ritalin kid. His parents divorced while he was still young, with his mother adopting 2 other children soon afterwards, Joshua and Heather. He put his energy into sports and his time on the high school football team, his grades remaining relatively average. His naturally good nature was tainted by his intense desire for acceptance, immaturity, and naivety for the first time when he joined a secret satanic cult operated within the school by fellow classmates. He started drinking and experimenting with drugs at 16 when he joined the cult that would later go on a campaign of desecrating local graveyards and committing vandalism by putting pentagrams all over Sierra County in the summer of 1987. This escalated further when the cult started poisoning the pet dogs of any resident who had a last name starting with R, leaving the dead animals on their owners' doorsteps. They terrorized female schoolmates by putting pentagram-covered letters inside of their lockers, stating very bluntly that they would find a virgin to sacrifice on Devil's Night. A string of burglaries that pertained to the disappearance of a multitude of guns and weaponry was committed with connections to the cult, authorities believing they were stockpiling for a massive assault on the community. It was posed after multiple victims of the cult came forward that David Parker Ray was the leader of this cult, each stating that the leader was an older gentleman named David. As an aside, this is about to get really disgusting, so I'd highly suggest clicking out if you don't have a strong stomach. Many of the cult members, including Yancey, were arrested on October 21st, 1987 for allegedly breaking into the home of Dr. Alfred Woodard, their English teacher, and leaving a dead dog's penis on his computer keyboard, along with the theft of $30,000 in property that was ditched nearby in Mud Canyon. They were sentenced to serve time in the New Mexico Youth Detention Center and, once released, were required to finish their schooling. A teacher named Nadine Gardner took Yancey under her wing and taught him English, later becoming his mentor and setting him on a better path for a short time. While underneath her wing, Yancey coached a local t-ball team and pursued his passion for computers until he graduated in 1989, subsequently enrolling in the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC, in Albuquerque. He was accepted into the Navy as an electrician and was a model seaman, returning to Truth and Consequences in 1995 looking like his future would be more than bright. This lasted all of a few months before Yancey started growing his hair out, trading in his clean-cut naval uniform for faded t-shirts and cut-off jeans, and began to take heroin, LSD, and mushrooms with other young adults in town. He was dubbed Toy Boy Roy by the locals due to his ability to charm women into short-lived affairs. Though he did marry a girl named Christina and had a son, he didn't stop his lifestyle of sleeping with multiple women and doing drugs. Yancey met and befriended Jessie Ray, the two spending copious amounts of time drinking and taking late-night cruises around Elephant Butte Lake, a tight bond being formed between them. They met and befriended a 43-year-old gay man named Kenneth Lee Lane, who had moved to New Mexico from Florida, believing the man to be a druggie with weird sexual tastes. Like most things in his life, this friendship between Yancey and Lane didn't last very long, and on January 1st, 1996, a foul smell coming from Lane's apartment resulted in law enforcement finding a body in the front room of the apartment. The badly decomposed body was that of Lane, and the incident was ruled accidental suicide by metallic poisoning, nuts and bolts of all types in his stomach, and a doorknob shoved up his rectum. Law enforcement also failed to notice the drawings of pentagrams, tables with black candles, and blood spattered all over the walls in the front room, and only suspected Yancey of the murder 13 years later. Yancey met David Parker Ray through Jessie in early 1996, being drawn into the sadomasochistic lifestyle through the abundance of drugs kept in the Ray household. He was happy to participate in the depraved parties Ray held, once admitting he was tied down at one of them and sodomized with a broom handle early on. Now that we've introduced Yancey into the picture and discussed his background, I think it's about time we talk about the next important victim in this disgusting saga, Marie B. Parker. Marie was born in Truth and Consequences March 12, 1975, to parents who were already at the end of their marriage with a family member she alleged molested her when she was a young girl. She ran away from home at 14 and spent the next 5 years drifting all across the US, returning home to stay when she became pregnant with her first daughter, Sierra, at the age of 19. She had a second child 2 years later, Kathleen, and worked the family business while becoming increasingly depressed and suicidal. She moonlighted as a prostitute and became a regular at Raymond's Lounge, where she would become friends with Jessie Ray and her gang. Upon meeting Jessie, she became a crank addict, with a multitude of men pining over her and offering to take care of her and her girls. She met Yancey in 1996 and the two started dating, becoming extremely close over their shared love for drugs and alcohol, and only breaking up when Marie wanted to clean her life up. She met a man named Seth Bates, real name is redacted, who she moved in with for a short time until she relapsed and started heavily doing crank again. She ended up homeless and took Jessie up on her offer to camp on the Ray family property in tents until she got back on her feet. This arrangement started to go horribly wrong when the typical July 4th partying began on the Ray property, one of the men in the group called Cliff Arthur allegedly sneaking into Marie's tent while she slept and molesting her. Even though the group of friends she ran with didn't believe this happened at all, Marie filed the complaint at the Elephant Butte State Park Ranger Station that resulted in New Mexico State Police immediately investigating it. Everyone involved was interviewed, with Jessie immediately discrediting Marie, stating she was quote-unquote messed up and getting flirty with another male friend. She rekindled her relationship with Yancey over crank during one of the string of parties held on the Ray property over the 4th of July week, but this possible high point was crushed when David accused Jessie of putting his reputation with the park rangers in jeopardy. Marie was left alone in her tent that same night and had a final flurry of suicidal phone calls to family and friends before she was never heard from again. She met with Jessie Ray at the Blue Water Saloon to score drugs and agreed to go with her in David's truck to do so, Yancey also present at the time. Per his testimony, this is what happened next. Jessie drove to exit 79 of the 125 to Vista Memory Garden Cemetery, where they were supposedly meeting a dealer, getting out and shoving a handgun in Marie's face as soon as they parked. She threatened to kill Marie if she continued to scream, restraining her with handcuffs and throwing her in the back where she was restrained by Yancey. He kept her subdued in the back seat the entire drive to 513 Bass Road, watching as Jessie dragged Marie to the toy box, which he explicitly knew was used for nefarious means. Jessie and David Ray spent the next 3 days torturing Marie, Yancey claiming he was never involved in anything that was done during that time. He was told on July 8th that the Rays were quote-unquote done with her, and that it was quote-unquote time for her to go, causing him to correctly suspect she would not leave the property alive. David and Jessie took him to the toy box where Marie was bound to a cot, gagged, stripped naked, and blindfolded, handing him a piece of rope saying quote-unquote, "You know what you're gonna have to do." Yancey did not protest and proceeded to strangle the helpless woman to death with the rope he had been given, putting a knee on her chest so he had enough leverage to strangle her quickly. He claims that a gun was held to his head during the allegedly taped murder that was later sold off as a snuff film. When it was dark enough to cover their misdeeds, Marie's body was wrapped in a dark blanket and carried into the back of David's truck, driving north towards Monticello County to be dumped in the ravine. She was buried in loose dirt before they left the scene, Yancey being threatened that he would be killed if he told anyone what had happened. Yancey and Jessie decided to skip town and hide out in Galveston until the ensuing investigation fizzled out. During the 3 days Marie was being tortured in the toy box, her mother initiated a missing persons report that was thoroughly investigated to no avail. A nationwide alert was eventually put out for Marie's disappearance after new evidence that suggested she might have run off to Las Vegas to end her own life came out on November 24th, 1997. Here is that exact report. While the horrendous torture and murder of Marie Parker was taking place, our final antagonist arrived in Truth or Consequences, Cindy Hendy. Cynthia Lee Hendy was born in Seattle to a father in the U.S. Navy and a mother that was a local beauty queen who regularly entered Seattle pageants in her attempts to start a career as a model. Cindy was a rebellious child that could care less about school and often ditched classes altogether, becoming a party girl that frequently went on alcoholic and drug-induced binges for days on end in her early teens. She eventually dropped out of school and became pregnant with her first child at the age of 16, Shane. Shane was taken away from Cindy and raised by multiple foster homes after his father abandoned her, the first of a long string of abusive relationships. One of Cindy's former husbands was a convict that was put in jail after assaulting her. Another was a cocaine dealer, and a third husband was put in jail for over 2 years for choking and threatening to kill her. Her personality always did a complete 180 when she was intoxicated, turning from considerate and kind with a love for romance novels and soap operas to aggressive and foul-mouthed, with a penchant for picking fights with other bar patrons. Her criminal resume began with a conviction for forgery and stolen property in 1979 and would lengthen due to constant felony convictions that one way or another involved alcohol, drugs, and theft. She was given 14 days in the slammer and a year of probation for a felony charge in 1990 and was jailed for 30 days in 1993 for selling cocaine to an undercover cop. She was so wrapped up in the cycle of abusive boyfriends and drugs that when her son was beaten by them and begged her to leave them, she refused for monetary gain and codependency issues. Cindy was officially classified as mentally disabled and used her social security checks to feed her drug and alcohol habits. She was once again arrested in 1995 for stealing aluminum pieces from a Department of Transportation storage shed that were worth $3.3 thousand, kicking the cocaine habit while she served time for this incident, only to go right back to using the drug when she was released. She would be in and out of prison for failed random drug tests ordered by the court. Cindy found herself in another rocky relationship with a biker named John Edward Youngblood and continued to party hard into the summer of 1997 when she faced serious time for refusing to take a court-ordered drug counseling course. Youngblood convinced her to flee to Truth and Consequences to hide out with his father, promising to meet her there when she had a place to stay. When Cindy got to Truth and Consequences, she cleaned herself up for all of 3 weeks so she could get free accommodations at a motel courtesy of social services. As soon as Youngblood arrived, she was kicked out of her motel and was forced to move into a bubble tent at Elephant Butte with him. By the end of 1997, the couple got into so many fights that Youngblood finally moved to Arizona to live with a new girlfriend and left Cindy behind. All the while, her drug habit got worse, and she started establishing herself as a hardcore partier among the local bar scene with the nickname Six Pack Cindy. Her habit was reportedly fueled by having sex with wealthy businessmen in the area, becoming such a menace that she would sleep with significant others of her quote-unquote friends. Around this time, David discovered Viagra and got a renewed desire to commit his criminal activities, and his 2 lackeys returned in 1998. Jessie and Yancey met Cindy when they returned to the bar scene and entered an odd 3-way relationship that consisted of orgies and sadomasochistic rituals at the Ray household that Yancey didn't want to be on the bad side of. He liked tying Cindy up and beating her, but freaked out when he would wake up handcuffed with her wanting to return the favor. While Cindy began to acclimate to the sadomasochistic lifestyle she'd been indoctrinated into, the Rays were getting very close with various underage girls in Truth and Consequences. One girl named Peggy Jones recounted how David had once told her that the best way to dispose of a body was to open up its chest cavity and fill it with rocks before tossing it into the deepest part of a lake. She also stated that while on a boat trip with the Rays, David said, quote-unquote, "I've got you now," as he tied a sail rope around her ankle. Another girl named Raina Persh recounted how she would often go to the Ray residence and be given as much alcohol as she wanted, even if they knew she was underage. A third girl named Amber Mitchell recounted how David once produced a sexy thong bikini for Raina and suggested that she wear it on a different boat trip. They became more emboldened over time, openly enacting horrifying methods of torture under the guise of willful participation in the production of bondage pornography. A witness to this is 38-year-old David Riviera, Yancey's secret homosexual lover and roommate directly after his return to Truth and Consequences. In August 1998, Riviera attested that he witnessed David handcuffed a sometimes prostitute by the name of Angelica Montano and tortured her with an electric cattle prod during one of their typical boat parties while Jessie filmed the entire incident. He alleged that Cynthia Hendy sodomized Montana with a gun while David gleefully directed Jessie on how he wanted the whole thing filmed, saying, quote unquote, "I don't want you to miss this part." Though he was told by Yancey that she was a willing participant, Montano discredited that when she showed up at the apartment the couple shared to express how she wanted to press charges against David. Riviera also testified that Yancey once offered to kill his estranged wife after she stole his car out of spite. Multiple other witnesses attested that the Rays brought home countless young female hitchhikers that would be introduced to various people and then suddenly disappear not long after they showed up. The final event I want to describe before I close this video out is extremely important because it cements a vile and twisted relationship between two of the four deviants in this case. The Rays threw a small party for very select friends on Halloween 1998 where there was going to be a black sacrifice to the devil, something that was common for them and Yancey. Cindy became obsessed with witchcraft after Yancey started to teach her about it, going to the point she couldn't stop reading everything she could about the subject. While at the home belonging to a friend of Ray's, Cindy surprised everyone when she boldly and happily proclaimed that she was no longer seeing Yancey romantically. She was now in a relationship with David Parker Ray. From here on out, things are going to go on a downward spiral, and the horrific events that we know now about this case would soon come to light.